It's still my favorite part. Hey, I'm Dr. Emerald, and
I'm Kat Garcia. Welcome to Painting Wellness.
And today's topic is going to be hard conversations and how to be heard. Part 1.
Yeah, we're going to do this in a couple parts. So, we talked about what are things we want to talk about, and one of the biggest things that we've been mentioning is how to have hard conversations in healthcare. And the reality is that we have to have hard conversations everywhere, right? Including in our relationships. Mm-hmm. And so I thought it would be a great idea for us to kind of dive into this and talk about, who we have hard conversations with and all those things. So, when we're talking about hard conversations, who do you think are the hardest people to have conversations with?
For me, at least, it's the people I'm closest with, or even there's maybe expectations of like hierarchy around. Like if there's someone usually that I put on a pedestal, I would say that's a big one for me. Boss, mentor.
Like authority figures.
Authority figure that I'm like trying to impress. I just love to please. So that's always like a big one.
That's a whole nother podcast.
Topic,
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, the first thing that I always ask is okay, who are you having this conversation with? And then, why are you bringing it up? Why now? Right? And it's well, I don't know. But a lot of times it comes with feelings in our body, right? Something happens and we just over and over again, and then we get triggered and we have feelings in our body. And I know that we've talked about sort of body work and trauma and things like that. Do you ever get stressed out and you just feel when you're having a conversation, you just feel it somewhere in your body and
Yeah, if usually the places that I start feeling it is my throat, my chest start to tighten up, usually in the moment. Mm-hmm. If it's something that's happening leading up that I'm mentally playing it out over and over again, which is not helpful ever usually, then I start feeling it in my stomach. That's where I would get that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So that's and you know what, that's actually really common. So a lot of people feel it in their tummy. It's kind of that anticipatory anxiety, and a lot of people feel it in their throat because it's about being heard. So right, we talk about the chakras, and that's that place, right, that we kind of feel closing up. And so it's you say something that's very interesting, and I've quoted you a couple times, which is, it's not a problem till it impacts us in something we love. Mm-hmm. Right? And we talk about that in body work. And it's the same thing with mental health and in relationships, because our body is such a big part of that, right? And so typically when we decide we're going to have hard conversations, it's because it's impacting. And now we might have held off until, ta-da, it's time.
Yeah.
So one of the biggest things that we talk about in my office is about I statements, right? And I think a lot of people know what I statements are. Have you I statements
I can certainly give it a go of at least how I interpret it.
Let's do it.
So I statements, in the way that I see it, is when I'm addressing a concern, I do my best, not always perfect, but it's a practice of stating, this is how it affects me, or I am feeling this way, as opposed to you are doing this to me. And I view that and see that as one, if I'm saying you, then it takes my authority, not authority, but I'm being passive or a victim in that sense of oh, I don't have any ability to change this, as opposed to this is how I am feeling.
Absolutely.
And I need to be heard, as well as then usually easier to have the conversation if I'm not casting some shade on you, because it's me.
Yeah, because when people say you, what happens? We get
defensive,
what do you mean? Hey, what are you talking about? And so, absolutely. So when we talk about I statements, we're going to talk about the event and how it made us feel, not the person. And I always think about shoes, because I got teenage boys, and it's if you leave your shoes in the middle of the living room, it's going to bother me. So it's not really your shoes, it's just somebody leaving shoes, right? So I feel frustrated when there's shoes in the middle of the living room, because it doesn't really matter whose shoes they are, right? It could be anybody's shoes. And the same thing happens when we're having conversations about anything. So if you hurt my feelings, I say, you know, I feel frustrated or hurt when I'm not heard, right? I feel hurt when I feel that I'm doing all the work in the home, or when I'm not, my ideas are not being heard in the office. So really it's about how I feel and what the event is. So you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. What do you think are some of the harder parts of having those conversations? Because I've heard a lot of examples like, I feel you're stupid. I'm like, no, that's not how that works. That's not how that works at all. But it started with I. I'm like, yeah, but we don't want to do that. So I know a lot of people struggle with that. What do you think are some of the hardest parts of doing something like that?
The first thing that comes to mind for me is like, I have to own my shit. Mm-hmm. I think that would probably be the first for, I'm like, oh, I like have to like really evaluate my role in this, and how am I feeling, what am I doing to like participate in some way mm-hmm. in this process. And still a hard thing, was a lot harder, continuing to work on that, but for me that would be the piece. Yeah, absolutely.
And I think one of the things that so owning your part, and also knowing that it's our perspective, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yes, I think that's a big piece. I thought it was you, but I heard this discussion around when you're having, and I apologize, I'm cutting you off here, but when you're having these type of conversations or anything with someone else, taking the perspective of there's a bridge between the two of you, and you are walking into the other person's perspective, or taking that time, so then you're able to look at it outside mm-hmm. of your own.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's at all, but that's what came to my mind, and
yeah, a little bit. Yeah, so one of the biggest things is that, you know, we can share an experience, right? Mm-hmm. We can share an event. We're both here. Jada's here, and we can all experience something different. Mm-hmm. So we're sharing the space, but my perception of what's happening and what your perception is completely different. And if something happens and I want to address it with you, I have to remember that your perception is your perception. So when I'm trying to talk to you about what's going on, it's going to be really, really important that you understand that you can't convince me and I can't convince you of what's happening, because that's called gaslighting. And I know gaslighting is like one of those big hot words right now, but that's exactly what that is, right? Is this idea that I'm going to tell you that your reality is not true. And so when we're having an argument, that is not the best way to have a conversation, because I can't convince you of how I felt, or that what I perceived was bad, right? And so really, it's really, really important that I listen to your perspective, coming from a place of listening and not trying to find an answer. Because if I try to convince you, we're not going to get anywhere.
Yeah, I think that, and that's a really hard part too, is that mm-hmm. listening part, because we all, as I demonstrated a few seconds ago, want to like be able to talk and jump in on these things, but being able to listen to what the other person is bringing instead of immediately just trying to solve, or because I've certainly can be a big proponent, or not proponent, but I can want to solve.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's probably a guy thing, but also an emerald thing, certainly. But I think that also helps get that perspective. That makes that perspective piece so much easier, as you were saying. It's like sitting in and listening and trying to put myself in where you're coming from. Is that what you're... I don't know if I'm like following...
Yeah, well, it's the idea that... And you don't even have to really understand, like, or have this understanding of where I'm coming from. Mm-hmm. I simply need you to have the understanding that I experience something, whether or not you experience the same thing. right?
Okay.
So, like, I might not understand where you're coming from.
Mm-hmm.
I might not understand how you thought it was okay to whatever,
Mm-hmm.
but I can definitely understand that that's your choice and that's your experience.
That's really helpful. I think that's because that also takes off a lot of the like for both parties of it's not like you don't have to fully understand the person, but it's understanding that they are experiencing this
Mm-hmm.
thing, whatever it might be, and I think that's a really like helpful way to look at it too. Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah.
Let me get my notebook out.
I
I'm
know,
taking
right?
notes
Take
on
some
that
notes.
one.
Take some note, people. No, and you know what? It's very interesting because we're always taught like, oh, you know, have a lot of sympathy, have a lot of, you know, try to understand where they're coming from. And the reality is that because a lot of us become defensive if we're in the same experience, right? We try so hard to understand where somebody else is coming from that we become defensive because we cannot understand where they're coming from.
So is that defensiveness coming out of a place of lack or like not being good enough to understand that, or the defensive is confusion and that's what can bring that defensiveness up?
Yeah, no, and
it.
yeah, it's not about not being good enough to understand. It's just that we just have different perspectives.
Okay.
And so we become defensive because if I don't if I'm trying to understand where you came from, rather than understand that your perception is your perception, I'm going to then try to defend why I did the way I did, not how you wanted me to do it. Right? So if I say, I can't understand where you're coming from, but I hear you, that it really upset you, then I don't have to understand necessarily like your deepest, darkest, inner child wounds that made you perceive that. But I do understand that I hurt your feelings, right? And so that comes with that. I can apologize for hurting your feelings without saying I'm guilty. Because I might not have been malicious. Yeah. I mean, how many times do we're like, well, I'm not going to apologize because I didn't do anything wrong. Because in your perspective, you didn't do anything wrong. But I didn't know I triggered some dark secret that you had, right? So I can apologize for hurting your feelings because it was not intentional. And I don't have to understand what it is exactly that there's coming from. And I'm not saying I did something bad. Because I feel like a lot of times we apologize and it feels like, well, if I apologize, I'm taking blame. And that's not, like, or we're taking blame or we're admitting that there was some sort of maliciousness, right? And so if we're walking down the road and I bump into you and I knock your coffee, I would say, I'm sorry. Nobody would say, oh my God, you did it on purpose, right? There was not necessarily maliciousness when I bumped your coffee, or maybe I was like, I'm just going to bump your coffee. Yeah. But it's so easy for us to do and apologize for something like that, but it is so hard for us to apologize for hurting somebody's feelings that are close to us without feeling like we have to explain. Like, I didn't do it on purpose, and, I don't understand why you feel that way, and simply just apologize because they have feelings, and unintentionally or intentionally you hurt them. So it doesn't mean that you're a bad person or did it maliciously.
I think that's really good. That's excellent perspective to take a step back and evaluate like how, when someone is starting to have that hard conversation with us or having a conversation about what they're feeling, how we can help in that process of making it easier. Because, yeah, it's not, like there's ways that we can be present and listen without like going down these rabbit holes of them just spiraling the conversation further into a direction that wasn't the intent probably in the first place.
Yeah, and I know that in part 2 of the series we're going to talk about how to really execute, and we'll talk about some skills to help us stay on track, because it's easy to have conversations and then, I don't know, like we all of a sudden go into this rabbit hole. I mean, we do it here all the time, but we're not arguing, right? So when we argue, it's easy like, well, you did this, and then all of a sudden well, you did this, and now we're not talking about this anymore, we're talking about that. And so there's actually techniques to help us stay on track. But yeah, it does help us to just listen from a place of listening and not trying to answer.
So if I'm needing to have or wanting to have either a hard conversation with you, is it worthwhile for us to maybe have this type of a discussion before we even get into the nitty gritty? Like, even if it's outside of like when that hard discussion needs to happen, of like, hey, I would really appreciate when we're having this discussion to keep. I'm just wondering, like, how do we maybe, and that's part 2, I guess. So you have to stay tuned for that. I'm like biting at the bit, but I'm wanting to talk about, for the person that's needing to have that hard conversation, of like some things that we can think about and do in order to get that rolling and have those hard conversations.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's really important is that we cannot, and so please don't come get me because I'm saying that whatever, it's generalizations, but generally speaking, we should not be having these really hard conversations when we're really pissed. Okay. Why? Because we talked about that flooding and being really upset. And so it's kind of that thing of like, well, I can't really ask you to not be defensive when you're already defensive. Right? So when we're having really hard conversations, it's really important that we take time to talk about, hey, this is how we're going to do conflict resolution. This is a better way to communicate when we're in a good place, right? When we can sit down and maybe have coffee and talk about how that last fight really sucked and we need to do better. And so that's when it's a great time to talk about conflict resolution and what I like to call fighting fair. And so, yes, we can have those conversations. And then if we must have the conversations when we're escalated, we can try to say, hey, just remember that I'm just saying it from my perspective. But in any conversation, it takes 2 people, right? And the onus of the delivery is on us as a speaker, and words matter. And so, again, if we're escalated, sometimes that can be really hard.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you mentioned the flooding that can happen in that, and the response that our bodies will go through with hormones and all these chemicals that are then flooding into our body that put us into a fight or flight response. And I've felt that so many times. Even, as I said, like, I like to replay or assume what these conversations are going to happen, and that already is starting that. Is like, if I'm talking with someone and they are creating the space to allow me to be heard, is that something that, like, I should just expect doesn't happen? Or, like, because sometimes I still feel that even when I am in a safe space, I still feel like
all the things.
I'm like, and I get confused, and I'm like, this person's being really, like, awesome about this, but, like, why am I feeling this way still?
Yeah. Well, I want you to remember what we just talked about. It's perspective. And, we'll at some point talk about narratives and how those run our lives, but my perspective of what conversations that are confrontational look like is mine. So you can create a really safe space, and until I am really secure that that's going to remain, I am going to still have those body responses, right? Because that's what we call trauma response, right? And so, when we talk about like, am I going to keep feeling this? That is, yes, until you heal that part. So I know that we have totally gathered tons of information today. And again, this is going to be a multi-part series, but let's do a little bit of the hunting part and give us the points.
I'm going to do my very, very best to like bring this in, because I was needing to take mental notes, and I was learning a lot in this conversation to like apply throughout a lot of things. Some the big things that were sticking with me is but it's okay if you don't understand the person, like where exactly they're coming from. It's when there's a conflict and I'm being, I guess, talked to or talked with, it's if I'm feeling like I'm needing to understand, that's taking me out of the present moment, and it's more about holding space, listening, and then acknowledging how that made them feel.
Absolutely.
Okay, perfect, check. The other pieces is like trauma and flooding can play a long part in our lives, potentially.
Absolutely.
And if there is space being created for it to be safe, we can still feel that, but that's okay. It's okay if we're still feeling it. It's that consistency and time that allows us to heal those type of wounds, so then we're able to go into that space and not have that type of flooding occur probably as much. Might still happen, I would say.
Absolutely.
The other piece is setting time to have conversations about how to fight fair, and how to have these tough conversations when we're not feeling so maybe overwhelmed or all the feels in that moment. And so that way maybe we can have a game plan and maybe even some like cues of like, oh, I am getting overwhelmed. This is what I'm going to be doing. But we're going to cover more of that actionable stuff in a second part.
Absolutely.
Was there other things that maybe I missed?
No, I think you wrapped it up perfectly.
Perfect.
So thanks for joining Painting Wellness, and catch us and listen next time.
See you next time. Bye.